It is said that in the early hours before the sun has fully remembered the world, when the Caspian Sea still breathes in slow silver waves, and the horizon is only a pale promise of light, a wandering dervish named Yunis arrived at the northern shore where the land of Persia leans quietly into water and wind. The old men of distant caravan routes still speak of him not as a man of miracles, but as a man who listened too deeply to the world, as if every sound carried the weight of a forgotten prayer. On that morning, the fishing villages were still half asleep, their wooden boats resting like tired birds along the shore, ropes creaking softly with the rhythm of the tide. The air carried the smell of salt, wet wood, and distant smoke from early hearth fires. And somewhere a single gull called out as though naming the emptiness between sea and sky. Yunis walked slowly along the shoreline, his sandals sinking into damp sand, his cloak darkened by the mist that clung to him like memory. He was not searching, for dervishes do not search in the way others do, but rather they allow the road to reveal what has already been waiting. It was here that he first saw the fisherman, an old man seated alone beside his nets, not mending them with urgency, but holding them loosely as if time itself had become too heavy to repair. The fisherman's boat was half pulled ashore, its wood worn smooth by years of water and weather, and its paint had long surrendered to the sea. The narrator must pause here, for it is said that loneliness near the sea has a different weight than loneliness in cities. It expands rather than shrinks, as if the horizon itself listens. Yunis stopped at a respectful distance, as travelers do when approaching another man's silence, and he observed how the fisherman did not look up immediately, as though he had already accepted that the world would come and go without announcement. The dervish greeted him gently, not with grand words, but with the simple acknowledgement that two human lives had briefly crossed on the edge of dawn. The fisherman finally raised his eyes, and in them there was no surprise, only the calm recognition of someone who has spoken more with waves than with people. They did not speak at first, for in such places silence is not absence but language, and the sea itself seemed to fill the space between them. The narrator recalls an old saying from the ports of Mazandaran, that those who fish too long begin to understand the mood of water more than the speech of men. And perhaps this was true of the fisherman whose hands bore the texture of rope and salt, whose face carried the slow erosion of years spent watching tides that never return the same way. At last the fisherman spoke, asking whether Yunis had come seeking passage or refuge, for in those times wanderers often meant one or the other. Yunis replied only that he was passing through, as all things do, even those that believe themselves still. The fisherman nodded as if this answer confirmed something he had long suspected but never said aloud. The sky had begun to soften, and the first thin line of sun touched the water, turning the Caspian into a sheet of broken gold and gray. The fisherman then returned to his nets, but not with haste, rather with the rhythm of habit that has survived disappointment. Yunis sat beside him, not as a guest and not as a stranger, but as one more quiet presence added to the shore. The narrator must tell you that in such moments, nothing remarkable appears to happen, yet these are the moments upon which entire lifetimes quietly rest. The fisherman eventually spoke again, this time not asking questions, but speaking of the sea as one speaks of a long acquaintance, unpredictable, generous in youth, and increasingly silent with age. He said he had once believed the sea would answer him if he waited long enough, but now he understood that waiting itself was the only answer ever given. Yunis listened without interruption, as dervishes are taught to listen not only to words but to the exhaustion behind them. Around them the village slowly began to wake. Distant figures appearing like faint ink strokes along the shore, carrying baskets, tending fires, preparing for another day of asking the sea for life. Yet here, between Yunis and the fisherman, time seemed to move differently, as though the tide had momentarily forgotten its duty. And in that forgetting, something fragile but real formed between them, not friendship, as men define it, but recognition. The kind that occurs when two lives understand they have both been shaped by forces too large to name. The fisherman finally tied one last knot in his net, and looked toward the horizon, where the sun now rose more fully, as if reluctant to reveal the day too quickly. He said softly that he sometimes wondered whether the sea remembers the faces it takes from the world, those who never return from its depth or distance. Yunis did not answer immediately, for such questions are not meant to be solved but carried. Instead, he watched the water, where light and shadow moved like thoughts that refused to settle. And so they remained there, two men bound by nothing but the morning, the sea between them speaking in a language older than either grief or hope. while the Caspian dawn unfolded as if it had been waiting all along for someone to notice its quiet arrival. The morning had now fully opened its eyes, and the Caspian Sea no longer held the pale uncertainty of dawn, but shimmered with a steady indifferent brightness, as if it had accepted the day without joy or complaint. The fisherman resumed his work with the patience of one who has learned that survival is not a sudden act, but a repetition of small movements carried across years. Yunis remained beside him, though neither man spoke for some time, and the silence between them did not feel empty but layered, like fabric woven from different shades of the same longing. It is said that the old fishermen of Mazandaran often spoke more to their nets than to their families, for nets do not interrupt and do not forget. Yunis watched the fishermen's hands as they moved roughened by salt and rope, and he thought of how every knot tied was also a memory secured, every loosened thread a memory released into the sea. At one point, the fisherman paused and offered Yunis a small cup of tea, brewed over a modest fire, its warmth carrying the scent of smoke and bitter leaves. They drank without ceremony, as men do when they understand that shared silence is already a form of companionship. The fisherman then spoke again, this time more slowly, saying that his son had once fished beside him, but had left years ago to seek work inland, towards cities whose names he rarely spoke aloud, as if naming them might make the absence sharper. He said he no longer knew whether the boy still lived by water, or had forgotten the taste of salt entirely. Yunis listened, and in his listening there was no attempt to console, for consolation often feels like a denial of truth. Instead, he asked what the fisherman remembered most clearly about his son. The old man smiled faintly, though it was not a smile of joy, but of distance, and said he remembered the sound of his voice calling out across the shore at dusk, when the light made everything appear as if it were already fading. The wind moved gently across the beach, carrying with it fragments of distant conversations, the creaking of boats, the soft cries of vendors beginning their day in the village behind them. The fisherman then pointed toward the water and said that every morning the sea returns what it chooses, but never in the form one expects. Sometimes it returns nothing at all, and sometimes it returns only the feeling of having lost something unnamed. Yunis nodded, and the narrator must say that in that moment he thought not of the fisherman's son, but of all the unnamed absences that accompany human life. Those silent departures that do not announce themselves yet remain forever present. A little later, a group of younger fishermen passed by, laughing briefly as they carried nets over their shoulders, their voices full of a kind of brightness that belongs only to those who have not yet been taught the full weight of waiting. One of them greeted the old fisherman, who replied with a slow nod, and then they continued toward their boats, disappearing into the rhythm of labor and tide. When they were gone, the shore seemed quieter again, as if their youth had momentarily disturbed the balance of stillness. Yunis finally rose and walked a few steps toward the water, letting the edge of the waves touch his feet. The sea was neither gentle nor cruel, it simply continued, without memory or regret. The fisherman watched him and said softly that wanderers often carry the same expression as the sea, as if they too are always leaving even when they are standing still. Yunis did not deny this, for there are truths that do not require defense. Instead, he spoke quietly of roads he had walked, of caravanserais, where strangers shared bread under flickering lamps of cities, where music drifted through open windows at night, and of faces he could no longer place in time but still remembered in feeling. The fisherman listened, and though he had never left his coastal village for more than a few days, he seemed to understand these distant places as one understands dreams one has never personally lived, but still recognizes as familiar. The sun had now climbed higher, and the light upon the water became sharper, less forgiving, revealing the depth of the sea in brief, flashing moments before hiding it again. It is said that midday on the Caspian does not bring clarity but intensity, as if the world is briefly forced to show itself without veil or softness. Yunis returned to sit beside the fisherman, and for a time they simply observed the movement of nets drying in the air, swaying like tired thoughts above the sand. The fisherman then said that perhaps life is nothing more than waiting for something that will never arrive in the form we imagine. And Yunis replied that perhaps the waiting itself is the arrival, though neither man claimed certainty in his words. And so the day continued around them, indifferent and ongoing, while the two men remained on the edge of water and land, sharing the kind of presence that does not demand understanding, only acknowledgement, as the Caspian Sea kept speaking in its endless, untranslatable language. As the afternoon slowly leaned toward evening, the light over the Caspian Sea began to soften again, not with the fragile hesitation of dawn, but with the quiet acceptance of things that know they must depart. The fisherman had finished his day's work earlier than expected, for there were days when the sea yielded little and days when it yielded nothing but time itself. He sat now with Yunis near the half-buried roots of a driftwood beam, where the shore bent slightly inward like a tired breath. The wind had grown gentler, carrying the scent of distant fires from the village, where families prepared evening meals and children's voices occasionally rose and faded, like small birds returning to unseen nests. The fisherman spoke less now, as if the weight of the day had settled into him, but there was no complaint in his silence, only the familiar resignation of one who has lived too long beside something greater than himself. Yunis watched the horizon where sea and sky blurred into a single quiet band, and he thought of how every meeting in life carries within it the seed of its ending even when it begins in calm recognition. It is said that travelers remember not the length of roads but the faces that appear briefly along them, and perhaps this was one such face, though neither man named it as farewell. The fisherman eventually stood and walked toward his boat, touching its side as one might touch the shoulder of an old companion. He said that he would set out once more before nightfall, not far, only enough to cast his nets one last time, for habit often outlives hope. Yunis nodded, and without invitation he followed at a distance, not to join the fishing but to witness the act itself as though it carried a quiet meaning he had not yet understood. The boat slid into the water with a sound like a sigh released after long holding, and the fisherman rowed steadily, his movements neither hurried nor reluctant, but simply practiced, as if his body remembered the sea more than his mind did. The water reflected the lowering sun in broken fragments, each wave carrying a piece of light that disappeared as soon as it appeared, like thoughts that cannot be held. Yunis stood at the shore, watching until the boat became a small shadow against the widening distance, and in that moment the narrator must say that the Caspian did not seem like a place but like a memory happening in real time, constantly forming and dissolving without asking permission from those who witness it. After some time the fisherman returned his nets, mostly empty, and he did not speak of disappointment, for disappointment implies expectation still alive, and perhaps he had long passed that threshold. Instead he simply sat again beside Yunis, placing the wet rope beside him like an old story set down after being told too many times. The sky had begun to change color, not dramatically, but gradually, as if the day were carefully stepping backward into itself. Yunis finally spoke, asking the fisherman whether he ever regretted remaining in this place all his life, never leaving the shore even when roads beyond it called to others. The fisherman considered this for a long time before answering, saying that regret is a word people use when they believe another life was waiting for them elsewhere. But he had come to suspect that all lives are placed exactly where they must unfold, even when they feel incomplete. He said he had once dreamed of cities, of bazaars filled with cloth and spices, of courtyards where poets recited verses under lantern light, but over time those dreams had become softer, less like destinations and more like passing images seen from a distance. Yunis listened and felt in those words a quiet understanding that did not require agreement. The wind grew cooler as evening approached, and the first stars began to appear faintly above the water, like thoughts emerging slowly from darkness. The fisherman then asked Yunis where he would go next, and Yunis answered that he did not know, for the road chooses its travelers more than travelers choose the road. The fisherman nodded, as if this confirmed something he had always believed but never traveled to verify. They remained there until night settled fully, and the sea became a dark, breathing presence without visible edges. At last the fisherman stood and prepared to leave, gathering his net with careful hands, and before turning away, he said only this, that the sea had never once answered him in words, but it had answered him in endurance, and perhaps that was enough. Yunis watched him walk back toward the village lights, his figure slowly dissolving into the dim shore like a memory returning to silence. The narrator must end by saying that some encounters do not change the world, nor the people within it, but they leave behind a subtle aftertaste in the heart, like salt that remains even after water has gone. And so Dervish Yunis for a while longer by the Caspian Sea, at night listening to the waves that carried no message, yet spoke more clearly than many voices, before continuing his journey into the unseen roads of Persia, where every departure is also another form of arrival.